So allow me at the outset to welcome you in the name of the Pura Center, the Humanities Division, and the Melammu Project to the second day of the 14th Melammu Symposium dedicated to the impact of ancient Near Eastern, the ancient Near Eastern world on religious practices in ancient Iran. Before proceeding with the introduction of our keynote speaker, I would like to express my gratitude to the Melammu board for the opportunity to convene this symposium at UCLA. It gives me, obviously, immense pleasure to introduce my esteemed colleague, Dr. Robert Rollinger, Professor of Ancient History and Ancient Near Eastern Studies at the University of Innsbruck, and the driving force behind the Melammu Symposia, as was confirmed to me yesterday, among others, by having a couple of drinks, by a number of friends and colleagues who are seeking asylum from Melammu. Professor Rollinger belongs to that rare breed of historians of antiquity, the kinds of whom we used to find in the German-speaking academe at the turn of the 19th to 20th century, for whom the world of antiquity constituted a connected expanse, which, notwithstanding the linguistic and cultural specificities, the historian of the ancient world had fully to grasp and maintain as a backdrop against which to illuminate the more minute historical phenomena. Thus, for him, the Mediterranean and ancient Eastern world are so profoundly intertwined that we have to move beyond more rudimentary notions of exchanges and connections and strive to understand this geography as an indivisible cultural expanse that calls for a more holistic treatment. Needless to say, to foster such ambitions today, at a time of extreme specialization, may be anathema to some and unattainable to others. However, Professor Rollinger's extraordinary publications and activities are a testimony that such a view has a legitimate place in the academia, and such pursuits are worthy of emulation. His work is too multifaceted for me to attempt an introduction at this juncture. Suffice it to say, his writing, beginning with his by now classical monograph on Herodotus' narrative on Babylonia, namely Herodots' Babylonische Logos, is a must for all students of ancient history and exquisitely illustrate not only his ability to command over different literary traditions, both cuneiform and classical, critically to assess or innovatively to synthesize them, but more importantly, shows his grand and wide perspective on what constitutes ancient history and historiography in the tradition we just described. Numerous are his monographs and articles on ancient Greece and the ancient Near East, on modi of historical thinking, ideology, and propaganda, and ancient Persia. As impressive as his writings are, his editorial work is even more breathtaking. By dint of their quality and prevalence, some 65 volumes by my last count, they have reestablished a holistic study of the ancient world as a discipline. Noteworthy in this context is his co-edited work Imperien und Reiche in der Weltgeschichte, epochenübergreifende und globalhistorische Vergleiche. You managed to make me stumble upon this long title, which represents a grammatology of empires, that is, the whole worthy attempt to infer, through the comparison of some 60 case studies of empires throughout the ages, on a catalogue of criteria, what she calls criterion catalog, defining imperial structures. I would also like to recognize his latest endeavor on empires with the creation of a new series, chez Greuter, entitled Empires Through Ages in Global Perspective, that has the greatest merit of creating ungainful employment for his coterie of friends for the next decade. Thank you very much, Robert. The proceedings of the Melammu conferences, or his editorship at the helm of the Classica et Orientalia, are just a few additional nuggets well, I wanted to say testifying, but I said terrifying. Testifying his prodigious creativity. Allow me to add, I deem him to be the most consequential and internationally recognized Althistoriker of our days. In his lecture today, Entangled Worlds, Afro-Eurasian Networks in Achaemenid Times, we shall see him practicing what I have been professing all along about him, Professor Rollinger will be reconceptualizing the notion of empire and redefining the role of the periphery in the interconnected world of antiquity. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Rollinger. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Rahim, for this much too friendly and nice to polite introduction. So thank you again, Rahim, for this kind introduction and the possibility to give the keynote here during this conference. So let me go immediately into medias res. Talking about Afro-Eurasian networks in Achaemenid times is a difficult task for at least two reasons. On the one hand, available sources on connectivity and network in Achaemenid times that cover the entire range of the empire and beyond are very terse and mainly indirect. On the other hand, there is, until very recent times, a deeply entrenched view in Western European perception of the empire that it was static and self-contained, ponderous and sedate, and, of course, without any ambition in trading and naval entrepreneurship, which are regarded to represent intrinsically Western and European qualifications. This obviously orientalizing perspective has its root in our sources, that is, in our Greek and Roman sources. From this backdrop, it is not surprising anymore that a well-attended exhibition on Alexander the Great at the Reichsengelhorn Museum at Mannheim in 2010 was advertised under the heading Alexander der Große und die Öffnung der Welt, Alexander the Great and the Opening of the World. The 448 pages strong catalogue bore the same title. Obviously, the world was closed and self-contained until the hero of the West, Alexander, was showing up. In this context, Alexander is presented as an explorer of the world. Beyond conquest, his main intention is said to have been to gain knowledge of the world. His main incentive was allegedly fueled by curiosity and a thirst for knowledge. Welterkundung und Welteroberung. Exploration of the world, guided by the conquest of the world, is regarded as Alexander's real impetus. Apparently, such views are heavily imbued by colonial perspectives of Asia, as well as by Western and Eurocentric ideologies. But they have shaped and guided and still do our ideas of the first real-world empire in world history. This also becomes evident when modern scholarship starts to talk about an entangled Afro-Eurasian world, the phenomenon of proto-globalization, and especially the history of the Silk Roads. There appears to be general agreement in modern scholarship of some kind that crucial developments towards these new forms of connectivity only took place with or actually after Alexander the Great, who, as we have already seen, is supposed to have opened the world just to become interconnected in the following decades. It does not have to be highlighted that such views presuppose Westerners as main agents within an alleged new arena of a suddenly dynamic and purportedly revolutionary changing world. This has been tellingly expressed in a very recent publication by Sita von Reden in the new Handbook of Afro-Eurasian Economies. I just quote the first line. The Hellenistic empires, you can see it on the slide, that emerged in the aftermath of the Macedonian conquest of the Achaemenid Empire laid the foundation for the connectivity of Asia, Egypt, and the Mediterranean for many centuries to come. End of quote. The same holds true for Greg Benjamin's recent book on empires of ancient Eurasia, where already the title leaves no doubt that the so-called First Silk Roads era has to be dated between 100 BC and 250 CD. Seen from this backdrop, it already becomes somehow amusing how Angelos Chaniotis' new book on the Hellenistic age was advertised towards a German-speaking audience. So you can see it here. Whereas the original English title of the publication is Age of Conquests, the Greek world from Alexander to Hadrian, its German translation became Die Öffnung der Welt, eine Globalgeschichte des Hellenismus. Obviously, there is broad consensus that the world was closed before Alexander's appearance. There was no connectivity connectivity, no trade, no mobility, just Oriental standstill, waiting for the Westerners to open the world and initialize entanglement and proto-globalization. If such a view would be true, we would have to ask our dear host, Rahim Shayegan, why, for God's sake, he convened such a conference, or at least what panels 1 to 4 can actually tell us about ancient worlds. Wasn't it a Greek, Hippolytus, or according to another tradition, Eudoxos of Kyzicus, anyhow a Greek, who was the first to realize the regime of the monsoon winds in the 2nd century BC? But wasn't there already Scylax of Carianda, again a Greek, who was the first to travel across the Indian Ocean in the 6th century BC? And what about Nearchus, who is supposed to be the first to have explored the shorelines of the Iranian coast? Apparently, this celebration of firsts is entirely indebted to a Western perspective and should be taken what it is, Hellenocentric constructions of an ever-growing world for a Greek audience. However, such a perspective becomes immediately problematic when it is uncritically adapted by modern scholarship. This is all the stranger as recent scholarship has convincingly demonstrated that empires lower the transaction costs and thereby foster transregional trade and exchange. By guaranteeing stable political order, which minimizes risk and promises higher profits, empires create imperial markets that can be described as social networks of the agents involved in these transactions, as Richard Payne highlighted for the Sasanian Empire and Kai Ruffing stressed for the Roman Empire. Why should this observation be only true for the empire of Alexander and the successors, and not already for the preceding empires of the ancient Near East? As a first look at Sita von Reden's interconnected world of early Hellenism immediately demonstrates, the constituent parts of this alleged first entanglement is just what was already united in Achaemenid times. So why should there be such a substantial change? In the following, I will try to show that such perceptions do not stand up to a critical analysis. I will thereby proceed in 2 steps. In a first step, I will develop some general thoughts, very quickly, on Afro-Eurasian connectivity long before the establishment of empires in the first half of the 1st millennium BC. I will consciously choose examples beyond the already well-documented trading network between the Middle East and the early Indus culture between 2300 and 1700 BC to highlight the range and omnipresence of these early developments of Afro-Eurasian entanglement. This is just to present a somehow banal overview on the already existing interactions long before the arrival of any Westerner in the Middle East. It is also revealing that most of the sources that offer substantial insights in these developments are archaeological and archaeobiological, and also linguistic ones, that have revolutionized our perspectives on the increasing phenomenon of proto-globalization already in the 3rd and 2nd millennia BC. This overview will be the basis to enter the second step, where I will try to collect and reinterpret the available evidence of transregional and proto-globalized exchange and trading networks in Achaemenid Persian times. However, as we will see, I will have to do this also on a comparative and indirect level, since the available evidence is still very slight and thin. So let us start with the first very short observations on general thoughts on Afro-Eurasian connectivity. And I just start with a very, very impressive piece of evidence originating from a grave from Eshnuna at the end of the 3rd millennium, beginning of the 2nd millennium BC, Tel Asma in the Diyala Valley, where in one of a grave outside of the palace, this fine piece of a copal pendant, which was not immediately recognized by the excavators, came to light. And what has been shown in a recent article, so this piece of copal, so again think about we are in 2000 BC, originates from a region which has to be located in Eastern Africa. So Eastern Africa and Madagascar, where this piece went up to the Diyala region. But this image can be put into a much larger framework of connectivity. So as we know now, major seeds that have been domesticated at the end of the 3rd millennium BC in Africa, which you can see 5 of these major seeds here. The most prominent are pearl millet and sorghum on the other side, are already transferred in the first half of the 2nd millennium BC, so around 1800, 1700, to India, where it is popping up exactly at this time. At the very same time, the Zebu cattle is imported into Africa, giving rise to a new hybrid cattle, which in the following centuries celebrates a huge success in African pastoralism. But this view can even be broadened, whereas we have first steps of this kind of interconnectivity, uniting and connecting the Africas, South Arabia and India. It is especially in the 1st millennium where similar developments take place in Southeast Asia, again very well testified by DNA, by very recent DNA analysis. For example, very important is this spot in Thailand, very close to the Isthmus of Kra, which became a important bottleneck around 500 BC, where trade is moving across this bottleneck on the one side, but on the other side also moving around modern Indonesia towards India. A very well developed exchange network where especially mung bean and horse gram are imported from India to Southeast Asia, but also very, very exciting the other way around, the banana, whose origin is somewhere in New Guinea and in southern Philippines, is transferred to India, and as we will see immediately at the beginning of the 1st millennium, is popping up in Eastern Africa. A comparable picture is connected with the sandalwood translocation on the one side and the early citrus fruits and mangoes which move from Southeast Asia to India. Let's have a look again at the Indian Ocean and the Africas. So at the beginning of the 1st millennium BC, where you can pick up this picture which I have just been developing, where you can see that this trias of southeastern seeds, the banana, the taro, and the yam, enters the East African coast, and it is very exciting to see that already around 500 BC, these fruits are popping up in Western Africa. There is this very prominent site, Nkang in Cameroon, dating between 500 and 400 BC, which testifies this development. It's also funny to see that this movement of fruits and resources is combined with the movement of, let's say, a commensal trio which joins the mariners, obviously, and this is the shrew, the Indian rat, and the Indian mouse, which also are popping up at exactly this time in Madagascar and in Eastern Africa. And of course, this has to be done with certain tools. And what we now know is that the main driving force for this technological revolutionary nautical development are these two different kind of boats, the single outrigger on the one side and the double outrigger on the other side. And it is very interesting to note that main parts of these boats are popping up as loanwords in the adjacent languages of the Indian southeastern areas, like in Hindi and in Tamil, where you can see the different loanwords that can be testified between the world of Southeast Asia on the other side and Africa on the other side. So you see this dimension of connectivity, which can be supplemented by evidence we have from the written sources of an interconnected world to a high degree already in the Bronze Age, but which gains a new dimension in the 1st millennium, as I will show to you immediately. And of course, this further step in the 2nd and then 1st millennium is driven by technological developments that revolutionize the land trade. That is especially the domestication of the camel on the one side and the horse riding. And this is just a nice piece. The earliest evidence for trousers we have from a grave in the Taklamakan, which you can see, from the Turfan oasis, which you can see here and which testifies to this new technology. So if we just summarize what I have been trying to do, summarize it in 3 different ways. That is in a chronological way. First, we can see that a new dimension of proto-globalization starts in the fourth millennium. The main agents, or let's say connecting the Red Sea, the Yemen and Ethiopia. A second step takes place in the 3rd millennium BC, which can be labeled, if you want, as the Bronze Age inter-Savannah translocations. So where we have this kind of connectivity between Northeast Africa, India, Arabia, which is of utmost importance. And then we have a 3rd step where you can see connectivity that is showing up now between Southeast Asia and Western Africa, between East and West Africa, as you may just remember, across the Sahara. We have been discussing this already yesterday, and including Southeast Asia. So this is a complete new dimension which we face in the 1st millennium BC. But this is not only something which we can observe concerning chronology, which is more important, and I would say more important for my talk, is if we focus on structure. If we look at what we know about the agents. So it looks like as if in the 1st millennium the first steps are done, let's say, in Neolithic context. That means that the main agents of these forces are small coastal societies, villages, lineage groups, or you may take it as you want. But it is very interesting to see when a new dimension is added in the 3rd and then in the 2nd millennium, the state, the developing states are somehow participated in this already developed change of networks. Urban societies are integrated, and of course, you know what is now coming. The next step in the 1st millennium has to be, in my opinion, convincingly to be connected with empire, which gives this development a new dimension, especially in combining land and sea routes and the horse and the camel as the driving forces, as already said. But there is another point which is also important and which will directly link what I will do in the 2nd step of my talk. That is geography. So if we look especially at the key regions that we can define of this interconnected Afro-Eurasian world in the 1st millennium BC, there are certain key regions which are absolute essential for the transfer of goods and commodities. So this is Chorasmia, which connects the steppe and Central Asia. This is Sogdia, which connects into the Iranian highlands and Central Asia, for especially the so-called 7 Stream land. This is Bactria, connecting Central Asia and the Indus Valley. This is the Indus Valley, or ancient India, nowadays Pakistan, connecting the Red Sea and the West on the one side, but also representing the end and starting point of the Karakorum highway, which moves through Gandhara from and towards the Taklamakan. This is the Iranian highlands connecting the Middle East and Central Asia. This is, of course, Khuzestan and Fars, which connect the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea. This is Oman as an important stop, the Persian Sea and the Red Sea. And, of course, Egypt and Nubia, they connect the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, and the Trans-Sahara and East Africa. And if you consider these core regions, so all of them are part of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. And I think this is absolutely telling. So what we face, and I give you a first view on this, is really a larger world where the empire in its core, but also the borderlands and the reach of the empire matter and create a much larger world that is fascinating. So this opens the 2nd part of my talk, where I try to specifically focus on this empire and the evidence we have from inside the empire on this new dimension of interconnectivity. So, and I will start with a famous inscription that takes us to Susa. the so-called Darius Foundation Charter, Darius Susa F, is a trilingual text from Susa that reports the erection of Darius' palace in that very city. It is important to note that the palace is conceptualized as a mirror image of the empire. This is accomplished in two ways. First, on a material level, that is, the diverse building materials originate from all parts of the empire. Second, on a human level, that is, all major nations of the empire participate in the building program either as craftsmen or as suppliers of important resources. And I just give you some impressions of the text. I will not read everything out, but just that you can see how it works. So this palace, which I built, I is Darius, in Susa, its materials were brought from far away. Downwards the earth was dug until I reached the rock in the earth. When it had been dug and the rubble packed, on one side its depth was 40 cubits, on the other side its depth was 20 cubits, and so on. And that the earth was dug downwards and the rubble packed and the bricks molded, the Babylonian did it. The cedar wood was brought from a mountain called Lebanon. The Assyrian people brought it as far as Babylon. From Babylon, the Carians and Greeks brought it from Susa, and in this way it continues. The gold which was worked here was brought from Lydia and Bactria. The lapis lazuli and the carnelian which was worked here was brought from Sogdiana, so you can see these important regions. The turquoise which was worked here was brought from Choresmia, and so on and so on. So this is this kind of larger picture which reveals this inscription. It is obvious that the main concern of this text is not trade and trading connections, but royal performance embedded into an ambitious claim to rule the entire world. But it is also apparent that trade and trading networks are showing through all lines of this important text. The Persian Achaemenid Empire is a deeply interconnected unity from its very eastern to its very western frontiers, from Chorasmia, Sogdia, Bactria, and Gandhara to Egypt, Nubia, Lydia, and the Greek world. The so-called lists of lands that are especially prevalent in the inscriptions of Darius and his son Xerxes highlight this guiding principle of the empire that, at its best, can be described by the three terms of unity, diversity, and plurality. In this worldview, the empire is conceptualized by two circles, a western and eastern one, that are built by the empire's nations in a geographical order, as Ankadan has demonstrated compellingly. Both circles touch each other at the center of the empire, that is a zone that runs from the Black Sea towards the Persian Gulf. It is that very isthmus where we find localized nearly all royal inscriptions and where all major royal seats, Persepolis, Pasargadi, Susa, Hamadan, Babylon, are situated. However, this is not only propaganda and royal ideology. Darius Susa F also exhibits a diversified world of production and division of labor, where regional specialization and connectivity are looming large. Some of the nations demonstrate well appreciated specialization in craftsmanship, the Babylonians for molding bricks, the Greeks and Lydians as masons and stoneworkers, the Medes and Egyptians as goldsmiths, the Lydians and Egyptians as woodworkers, the Medes and Egyptians for decorating the walls. Others are just responsible for transportation along the routes that, like a net of arteries, infuse the whole empire. It is of special interest that it is exclusively people from the West who are charged with these obligations. Some aspects of what has been elaborated deserve a deeper treatment. At first glance, craftsmanship looks primarily allocated to the western half of the empire. But with the Medes, you can see them here, there is a prominent representative of this specialization also in the east. This is even more important since there are indications that the Medes are used as a cover term for the entire Iranian population of the eastern part of the empire, including the Armenians. As Margaret Cool-Root has demonstrated, the depiction of the Median delegation on the Apadana represents, on the one hand, a notion of non-Persian but pan-Iranian connectivity, on the other hand, a concept of craft enterprise and fabrication that does not really fit into a general idea of a pastoralist population on the move. Also in this context, it is much more appropriate to think of a mainly sedentary population where, however, horse breeding played a crucial economic role and where horse riding became a distinctive marker of nobility and social distinction. Then the traditional view of a primarily pastoral nomadic population in the Iranian East does not match the much more complex societies in these regions has been made clear convincingly by very recent research. This does not only apply to the regions within the Persian Achaemenid Empire, but also beyond. It is true that the transition to actual pastoral nomadism as practiced by horseback riders only emerged around the turn of the first millennium BC. But evolving societies are much more complex and diversified than generally thought. This has just recently been demonstrated for Iron Age southeast Kazakhstan, where the traditional idea of an entirely nomadic population of horse-riding warriors turns out to be a trope. What we find is a mixed agro-pastoral population in a decentralized state of a larger sedentary population together with transhumant herders. Nevertheless, trade with horses and upcoming cavalry units started to play a major role, not only within the borders of the Persian Empire, but also beyond. Different riding attire and riding techniques on the Neo-Assyrian reliefs on the one side and on the Persian Achaemenid reliefs on the other side might hint at different supply routes for the acquisition of horses. At least for the latter times, Central Asia seems to have played a major role for the supply of horses. In terms of number, cavalry units might not have yet been of that importance as generally assumed, but horses and riding became an essential marker of status and social prestige, and as a signifier of military prowess. Median horse breeding looms large in Assyrian as well as in classical sources, and on the Apadana relief at Persepolis, a total of 6 Iranian group brings the horse as tribute. As has become clear by the studies of Margaret Kulrud again, the so-called median garment is an equestrian costume especially suited to hard-riding horsemanship and under harsh conditions, and you can see the different parts of this garment here. The costume is worn by 10 different groups on the Apadana reliefs, and it is the Medes, the first group in the entire display, which you can see here, that set a template for all non-Persian Iranian peoples of the empire. However, this riding costume is almost 100 years older than the depiction of the Apadana relief, since it appears for the first time on the famous seal PFS 93, so Mark, that's just for you, inscribed in Elamite with the legend Cyrus the Anshanite, son of Thespis. This refers to the emerging intensive contacts during the early Iron Age between the worlds of the Iranian highlands and that of the steppe between southeast Siberia and the Black Sea. These contacts considerably increased since the 7th century BC and became a major issue, especially in the 5th and 4th century BC. As more and more recent findings make apparent, horse riding was not the only interest that connected the Achaemenid Persian Empire, with a frontier zone that extended far beyond an area of the empire's direct influence and control. The much more diversified economies of the pastoral societies of the steppe became more and more intertwined with the empire, with social, political, and economic repercussions on all levels. This can now be studied in details with a huge amount of findings from Kurgan burials in the area immediately to the south of the Ural, along the rivers of Ilek and Or, which you can see here in more detail in the next one. The findings with materials of Achaemenid Persian style can be divided into 3 different chronological groups. The first group starts already in the 6th century BC, thus immediately after eastern Iran and Central Asia came under Persian control, and extends until the first half of the 5th century. Within this first group, small vessels of multicolored glass, together with small pieces of jewelry, dominate, most of them of Western Asian and Egyptian origin. This is especially true for small Egyptian faience flasks, thus exhibiting the special appreciation of perfume and fragrance from distant lands. Beyond this, special connections to Western Asia and the Levant, there are also cowrie shells from Southeast Asia and stone beads from India, which testifies for a proto-globalized world where elites from the steppe not only gain increasing interest in products from the empire, but also exploit these products to multiply prestige and demonstrate status. But there is even more about these early findings, since the accompanying pottery of these findings nearly exceptionally originates from Chorasmia. You remember the importance? It is obvious to conclude that this huge oasis region along the lower Sur and Amur Darya was a major hub for transregional exchange and trade. This fits perfectly well in what we know from later periods, especially from medieval times. The second chronological group The second chronological group with Achaemenid findings belongs to the late 5th and first 3/3 of the 4th century BC. It is within this period that suddenly precious metal containers, together with luxury furniture, heavy jewelry, garment embellishments, prestigious weapons and bridles are showing up. A special piece is an alabaster vessel with a quadrilingual inscription of Artaxerxes. So in hieroglyphic and the cuneiform you can see up here, in hieroglyphic Old Persian, Babylonian, Elamite. Concomitantly, glass vessels nearly disappear. It is also interesting to note that pottery from Chorasmia is not present anymore. This might indicate new trading routes and reconfiguration of exchange networks. So looking at the findings as a whole, there are two peaks of concentration. The first half of the 5th century, with small pieces of glass and jewelry, exchanged mainly via Chorasmia, and the first quarter of the 4th century, with all kinds of prestigious objects of high value. It is also important to note that these prestigious objects are concentrated in a small number of individual boroughs that have been interpreted as royal. With some caution, the findings have mainly been connected with workshops from Asia Minor, Thrace, and Iran. This would somehow fit to the information we have already gained from the tribute bureaus of the Apadana reliefs. It is true that Egyptian workshops are missing in the second group, but they are important in the first one. Some of the objects have been transformed concerning their use. With the increase of imported objects in the 5th century, the local societies transformed concerning their social and political structures. There appear at least two local centers of power, one at the river Ilek, the other at the river Or. One of the questions still under debate is whether the objects from the empire have consciously been produced for a local market, that is a market of the steppe, and whether there have been established special marketplaces along the frontier zones. Comparable examples are very well known from the frontier zones between China and the Xiongnu, for example. Another issue is the original character of the objects, ranging from trading goods to plunder and gifts. It has also been assumed that there existed special workshops around the courts of the local satraps that imitated the style of the royal court and produced distinctively for the frontier markets. It is also not entirely clear whether the local gold deposits at the southern Ural have already been exploited during this period. Another important issue is the recruitment of man-force from the steppe by the Persian Achaemenid Empire. To a certain degree, this must have been the case, thus revealing the same transregional frameworks and networks that the later Roman Empire shared with the Germanic worlds to the east of the river Rhine. Classical sources like Herodotus and Ctesias report about Scythian soldiers within the Persian army, not only horsemen, but also Scythian bowmen who served as mariners. Saka soldiers are also documented as landholders in Achaemenid Babylonia. They received plots of lands in exchange for their military service. Obviously, these men did not till their plots themselves, but leased them for a rent to local businessmen. The most important agent was the house of Murashu in Nippur, where a huge amount of documents originating from the second half of the 5th century are preserved. So, concerning Achaemenid findings from the steppe, the famous objects from Basirik are looming large. The extraordinary pile carpet and a wooden saddle, so the wooden saddle is the next one you will see, cloth, both from barrow number 5, traditionally dated to the 4th or early 3rd century, stand out with their impressive Achaemenid motifs. Søren Stark has dealt with these findings in detail. Even if the kurgans of Basirik are now dated to the first half of the 3rd century and appear to be post-Achaemenid, the findings are important testimonies of the intensive exchange networks between the Achaemenid Empire and the steppe, and the empire's profound impact on the social and political structures of these frontier zones. The same kind of context also existed towards the Western world. I have already mentioned the inscription of the Darius from Susa. The Darius palace had been constructed by laborers and resources gathered from every part of the great king's empire. This also included Westerners like Greeks from the Aegean. Apart from these written sources, the archaeological remains of the royal palaces in Basargadi, Persepolis and Susa contain clear indications of Greek craftsmanship. This craftsmanship is present too at the western periphery of the empire in the form of sarcophagi of the royal necropolis of Sidon or the offering of the temple boys of Bostan es-Sheikh, both of which are influenced by Greek tradition. Thus, it is not only the Far East, but also the Far West that was integrated within the empire's reach. An Aramaic report from Egypt on customs dating to the beginning of the 5th century completes this picture. This singular document allows us a wholly unexpected peek into the trade relationship of the Egyptian satrapy. Sidonian and Greek merchantmen seem to have dominated the market. They imported wine, oil, perfumes, metal ores such as iron, copper, and tin, but also timber, wool, and a host of convenience products. The points of origin of some of these goods are clearly indicated, such as for the Greek and Sidonian wine or for Samian clay. One primary export article was Egyptian natron, which was used in a variety of ways. It is worth pointing out that this important document not only reveals trading connections with Greek regions within the Achaemenid Empire, but also beyond, that is, with the Aegean world that lay outside the dominions of the great king. In this very context, let us not forget the fashion phenomenon so popular in 5th century and 4th century Athens called Berserie by Margaret Miller, which included clothing styles, eating habits, luxury goods of every kind, and even architectural forms and structures. Even in times of conflict, Berserie and the barotimes of the empire were highly promoted and appreciated in the distinguished circles of high society in the Greek polis. Margaret Root's idea on the structural connections between the Parthenon frieze and the Apadana reliefs perfectly well fits into this scenario. The Persian Achaemenid Empire was a powerhouse of proto-globalization, with a dramatic impact on its frontier zones in east and west, north and south. It is only due to a biased Western perspective already deeply rooted in our classical tradition that the true significance of this first Afro-Eurasian empire in world history is still ignored. However, it is not only the frontier zones where the sheer presence of the empire and its imperial market triggered social development of fundamental change. It is also within the empire where people from all around the world met and came into contact with each other. This can be perfectly demonstrated by the available written sources from Babylonia and Persia, and just pick up two of them. A document from Persepolis fortification archive refers to one sheep or one goat a certain Bakambama has received for a group of Greeks that was on its way to Persepolis. Of special interest is the place from where this group of Greeks set forth. Since the document is a travel authorization of Bakabadush, who is the Persian satrap in Arachosia, the gang had been sent there to perform some kind of unspecified work. With this document, it becomes obvious that the presence of Greeks can be attested at the very eastern fringes of the empire already around 500 BC. The evidence of Easterners in the Persepolis fortification archive is of special interest in this context. As Wouter Henkelmann has demonstrated recently, Bactria and Arachosia were, as he calls it, I quote, tightly woven into the tapestry of the empire, end of quote. The more we fully understand the documents from this archive, the level of internal coherence between the various parts of the empire becomes evident. This is on the one hand true due to the incessant stream of traveling groups all through the empire from one end to the other. On the other hand, we start to recognize a harmonized and uniform bureaucracy that worked according to the same principles and guiding lines from Central Asia to the Aegean. This administration used established patterns of language and format to address and deal with bureaucratic issues. This not only applies to the so-called Imperial Aramaic that was established as a major bureaucratic tool all over the empire, but also to Elamite, as at least one surviving example from the Achaemenid archive from Kandahar reveals. From this backdrop, it does not surprise that one of the major legacies of the Achaemenid Persian Empire is the spread of Aramaic, language as well as alphabet, from the highlands of Iran across the Taklamakan towards China. The earliest testimonies of writing in India, originating around the turn from the 4th to the 3rd century BC, perfectly demonstrate this pervasive and stimulating influence. With a high degree of probability, this development is not post-Achaemenid at all, but was already triggered during the heydays of the empire. This also applies to other new forms of bureaucratic technique, like the counting with tally sticks, that are attested for the first time in world history in the Bactrian archive of the Khalili collection, dating to the end of the 4th century BC. These tally sticks are especially suited for communication with illiterate people and between speakers of different languages. They may have been a special instrument for communication with traders and elites from the steppe. One may assume that the satrapal administration of Bactria used this instrument to co-opt tradesmen and to control the caravan trade with the Central Asian frontier zone. In order to do so, the local administration might have furnished traders with capital in silver, like it is very well attested in Babylonian temple households of the same period. Ctesias mentions Bactrian merchants on camelback trading missions who take carpets to Parsa, I quote, woven with different colors of undyed camel wool, end of quote. Evidently, they sold these products for very high prices. Be this as it may, not long after the end of the Achaemenid Empire, tally sticks as a specific technique of administration are attested in archaeological contexts of the Taklamakan and in other parts of the world. The speed of communication within the empire was breathtaking. As has been demonstrated by Henry Colburn, a mounted courier could cover approximately 230 kilometers per day. This means that messages and notes could be exchanged between Central Asia and the Mediterranean within a couple of weeks. This had, by the way, massive consequences on the existing worldviews and the perception of space and time that changed considerably. Returning to the Persepolis archive, it becomes more and more apparent that the Indian regions were somehow supervised by the satrap of Bactria. Irtabanush, the satrap of Bactria, was presumably the brother of Darius, appears to have had a superior position towards the satraps of Hindush, Irdukbama, Gandhara, Irtakdama, and Arachosia Bakabadush. So you can see them all here. A new interpretation of the green chert mortars, pastels, and plates from the Persepolis treasury archive suggests that these items originate from administrative center of Achaemenid Arachosia. About 200 of them bear Aramaic inscriptions exhibiting Iranian administrative key terms. As Wouter Helkemal puts it, I quote, recurring elements in the formula are the fortress, where the object was made, the craftsman, the acting supervisor, the prefect or governor, and a year date, end of quote. Items and inscription most probably refer to local craft centers with their specific hierarchies and administration. These factory-like facilities were supervised by a prefect and part of a satrapal network that collected taxes and tribute that was partly sent to Persepolis. After this tour d'horizon, we return from where we have started, that is, the area of the Persian Gulf. So far, we do not have much evidence that trade along the Persian Gulf and further on towards India already played a major role during Persian Achaemenid times, but we have any right to do so. On the one hand, we are now able to attest with a high degree of probability the existence of a satrap of the islands in the Persian Gulf. You can see it also here. This office of this Bagina can very well be compared with what we know from similar office holders in Parthian and Sasanian times. That the Persian Gulf started to play a major role also becomes evident from gigantic infrastructural projects along the Iranian coast of the Persian Gulf. These projects already started with Cyrus as the construction site of Tamukan in the Borazjan district in the hinterland of Bushehr reveals, and continued with Cambyses at Matanan in western Fars. The royal palace at Abanu in the sealand of southern Babylonia, very well attested during Cambyses' reign, when the royal entourage stayed there for about an entire week, also belongs to this flourishing and interconnected network of regions along the northern and northeastern shores of the Persian Gulf. At the same time, groups of Indians receive fields of land in Babylonia as fiefs for their military service. But this is not only a man's world, as the documentation of a Gandharian woman in Babylonia and a Bactrian woman in Sippar testify to. And there is the wider world of products, as a Babylonian document from the Achaemenid period originating from Uruk highlights, mentioning linen textile from the Indian satrapy of Gandhara. Moreover, if we take the regions and satrapies controlled by the empire in the east not as an accidental result of the great king's conquest, but as a conscious act of expansion towards central communication routes, it becomes evident that the Achaemenids controlled all of those regions where, as we know from later periods, the most important streams of communication from China and the Taklamakan to the west ran through. If we combine this evidence with one of Darius' major infrastructural endeavors, that is, the construction of a channel between the River Nile and the Red Sea, and try to get rid of classical patterns of interpretation, just highlighting royal performance and self-indulgence, we suddenly recognize an empire that for the first time in world history connected the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf, and the Indian Ocean. It is interesting to note that the economic dimension of this gigantic project are still fairly ignored by modern researchers, as they mainly focus on the great king's alleged megalomania. Thus, Jean Iot expressed his doubt whether the famous statue of Darius found in Susa but produced in Egypt was brought to Iran by circumnavigating the Arabian Peninsula. However, this is only true if we believe the Hellenocentric and Eurocentric narrative that it was only Greeks, like Scylax of Karianda and later Nearchus, who explored the world, whereas in earlier times the world was somehow dark and unknown. From such a perspective, the Achaemenids had no real idea about the worlds, and the inhabitants of Asia had to wait for Alexander and the successors to open up the world. This is not to deny the challenges for any sea travel in northern direction to the north of the 20th line of latitude in the Red Sea due to the difficult currents and winds. However, these challenges have already been mastered progressively since the 4th millennium BC, and the various expeditions of Egyptian pharaohs or kings towards Punt are telling examples of these efforts. But what is more, in one of the stelae that lined Darius' canal, the great king explicitly proclaimed that it had been built for ships to travel from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf. So I just quote, "I ordered this canal to be dug from a river called Nile, which flows in Egypt, to the sea which goes to Parsa." So as you see, it's very important to translate Parsa not as Persia, but as Parsa, the province of Fars, to go to Parsa. So this canal was dug as I ordered, and ships went from Egypt through this canal to Parsa, as was my desire. Is this just rhetoric? Doesn't this perfectly fit into the larger context of a progressively interconnected Afro-Eurasian world since the middle of the 1st millennium, where the empire was key for these revolutionary developments? But there is even more than this. As we are well aware from recent studies, Kassite Babylonia of the second half of the 2nd millennium BC controlled central western Iran, and thus the western branch of the Khorasan route, or the Silk Road, connecting the Mesopotamian lowlands with the Iranian highlands. This testifies to the importance to the land route during this time. The Assyrians appear to have continued this policy from the 9th century BC onwards, they were eager to control the very same area. In the following centuries, the Assyrians could expand their control of the Iranian plateau far to the east. It might have been the never-ending conflict with the Chaldeans and Elam in the south that fostered the importance of the land route in Neo-Assyrian times. With the collapse of the Neo-Assyrian and the establishment of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, the geopolitical constellation appears to have changed completely. Obviously, the Neo-Babylonians were not able anymore to control the western branch of the Khorasan road. This situation became even more dramatic when around the middle of the 6th century BC, a new power arose with Cyrus of Anshan that started to control entirely the land route. Of course, this does not have to mean that traders from Babylonia could not use these routes anymore, but taxation and toll was not in Babylonian hands anymore. The same is true with the maritime route along the Persian Gulf, and one may even hypothesize that the rise of Anshan was somehow connected to an increasing importance of the seaborne long-distance trade. The transfer of the Babylonian royal residence from Babylon to the oasis of Tema by Nabonidus may not only be explained by the Babylonian aim to control and tax the profitable trade with the Arabian Peninsula, but also by the wish to watch out for alternative routes to India, Melucha, via the Red Sea. Be that as it may, Babylonian trade with the East and India is well attested. It is very plausible to connect the intensive building projects of Cyrus at Tamukan and Cambyses at Matanan in western Fars with the intention to foster and strengthen trade routes along the eastern shores of the Persian Gulf. Similar developments can be observed in early Sasanian times, when the new rulers from Fars rerouted and redirected the trading networks from the eastern shores of the Arabian Peninsula to the eastern shores of the Persian Gulf. What Richard Payne exemplified for the Sasanian Empire, based on the geographical situation of the Iranian highlands, must also have been true for the Achaemenid Persian Empire in its early stages. I quote Payne, "The geography of Iran posed major disadvantages to empire formation, not least the difficulty of extracting revenues from disparate highland territories and the high costs, slow pace of transferring agrarian produce overland to imperial centers. But its predicament also represented a potential advantage, located at the nexus of the largest Eurasian markets." End of quote. Although there was nothing comparable with the Roman and Chinese markets of Sasanian times, the emerging Persian Empire was, as we have seen, at the nexus of all major trading routes connecting Afro-Eurasian worlds. The Achaemenids just appear to have expanded what their Tayspid predecessors had started, following the already existing trajectories, which started to become even more important. Seen from this backdrop, I believe that we have any reason to reconsider a common belief in recent studies on connectivity in world history. Globalization and new dimensions of entanglement did not only start in the Hellenistic era, but much earlier. Thank you for your attention.